Welcome everybody, let's get cracking. My name's James Crabtree, I'm the comment editor at the Financial Times and I'll be your chairman for the next hour. We're running through until 12:15, which means we've got a lot to get to, so I will be very brief. Our panel today are a distinguished lot. I will introduce them in the order in which they are to speak. So I think we agreed that Chris Rhodes from Nationwide will kick us off. Then Gerard Lemos will come next, Matt Oakley, Head of Economics at Policy Exchange, and then Jesse will sum up the panel. So that'll take us to about halfway through, I guess, but they're going to try and restrict themselves to 5 minutes each, and then we'll have half an hour for discussion. The title today is, well actually I'll just stick to the discussion. The discussion is there a way in which we can improve our savings rate? It's an interesting discussion to be having at the moment because in one way the last thing Britain needs is a sharp increase in its savings rate, particularly one that might reduce demand. On the other hand, Britain has a less pronounced savings culture, particularly than its continental counterparts. We save a lot less than Germany. Traditionally, we have saved in ways that have not been economically productive. We've pumped a lot of money into housing. We've traditionally put a lot of money into occupational pensions. Both of those markets are declining in some sense, and therefore there is a need to find new ways to boost savings rates. This can come with various forms of carrots and sticks. Some people back forms of compulsion to try and get the savings rates up. Others, perhaps including Jesse, given he is one of the chief philosophers of the big society, might look instead to more innovative measures involving transparency or nudging, for instance. But anyway, the question of what is the problem with Britain's low saving rate and what can be done gives us plenty to get our teeth into. And with that, I will be quiet and hand over to our first speaker.
Okay, I think I'll start with a few observations, I think, as to why it's important we try and get the nation saving again. I think accepting the point about if everyone started saving today it would have an impact on growth. I'm more talking about through the cycle. So over the last 10 plus years, credit growth has massively outstripped savings growth to the extent that the UK has ended up with a 300 to 400 billion funding gap that needs to be funded out of the wholesale money markets, which clearly isn't good for the economy. Secondly, as we go through the cycle that we're currently going through, savings are at an all-time low, for which I think they have two impacts. One on the emotional benefit of individual consumers who feel exposed from a point of view of being able to sustain their lifestyle or take shocks if they were to be made unemployed. But I think secondly, and perhaps from a far greater point of view, the impact at the moment, if there was more savings and you were drawing down on your savings now to sustain the economy, we would have less of an economic impact than we've currently seen. I think customers, though, recognise the need to save, and our research suggests that 80% of the population know they need to save, but less than half that group believe they're saving sufficient to meet their needs. So I think one of the questions we need to answer is why are people not saving, even when they recognise the need to save? And I would contend that's about both the complexity of the products that we, financial services companies, offer, but also the incentives to save, I think, are less than the incentives to borrow. At which point, I think I'll leave it.
That's a model of brevity, so well, thank you. Well, let's go over to Gerard.
Hardly worth adding anything at all, are they? on that basis. I think in addressing this question of whether we need radical solutions, we need to factor in some longer term trends as well as the short term economic things that are going on. At least we hope they're short term, they may not turn out to be. And there are social and economic trends here working together, it seems to me. I mean, we have seen over a long period of time, and no doubt will continue to see, a big risk a big shifting of risk from the state to individuals, and also from companies to individuals with the decline of company pension schemes. So people are much more out there on their own than they were in the past. There is some quite good data that suggests, number two, that median wages have got stuck, and they were already getting stuck before the recession, before the crisis. And so maybe there is an issue about whether people just are earning enough to save, and whether there are any realistic prospects of their income rising even if the economy started to recover in that median group. And that might be something to do with the structure of labour markets and so on. I think people say, we've become a consumer society and so on, or perhaps we have, but we also have had the longest period in a cycle of low interest rates and cheap money, perhaps too cheap money, for many a long year. And so for many people below a certain age, they have no memory at all. They have never been adults during a period when money has been expensive. So this idea that behaviour has changed, well, for many people, there never was a time when it was difficult to borrow. I think one thing we've learned, and Jesse may say more about this later, is that just transparent, and this, I think in a sense, is what we've learned from regulation in the last few years, and I came to this job from regulating retail banking. Just transparency, just providing information and education, while a good thing in itself, obviously a good thing which promotes competition and so on, it does not drive action, it does not drive behaviour change. So we have to be more assertive, more perhaps directive. That old joke from Ronald Reagan, I'm the man from the government and I'm here to help, well, perhaps not as assertive as that, but it seems to us that in terms of policy and in terms of the money advice service, we do need to be more assertive with people. And clearly auto-enrolment is a big elephant that's coming along, which is a pretty assertive elephant, more a prod than a nudge, it seems to me, and that will make a big difference to pensions over the next few years. And then, of course, there's my own organisation, the Money Advice Service. We launched earlier this year, and we are paid for by the industry via a levy on the FSA, and we'll be offering free, we are already offering free independent advice about every aspect of money, from debt to preventing problems in the future and planning future finances, your future financial situation. So savings, and this is very important to us, particularly as the sort of people we're advising, perhaps not at the wealthier end of the market. They're generally people on rather modest incomes. Savings has to be seen as one part of a bigger picture, bigger financial picture in people's lives. And we're pretty sure that whatever the situation, just telling people that the situation is worse than they think it is not going to influence them to behave better. What we have to do, and our research makes this pretty clear, is first of all, people have to know where to turn to for advice, and we have to build a brand that is universally recognised. If you like, that's the kind of the Ghostbusters question. So who do you call? But we also have to show that actually managing your money better, and saving, of course, actually makes your life better. Not just in financial terms, but in terms of security, in terms of aspirations. And all our research shows that there are a great number of urban legends out there about why people don't save or why they behave the way they do. It's to do with people who live in certain parts of the country, or it's to do with gender, or whatever it is. Our research shows that actually it's to do mostly with people's attitudes, and it's attitudes that we will seek to influence as a precursor for behaviour. It's about how you think and feel. And that's obviously more difficult in public policy terms, because you're seeking to influence something rather more deep-seated, but that's the thing that seems to make the difference. So what we're doing is building a service which provides for people with different attitudes, but also takes key moments in in their adult lives when managing money becomes critically important. Now, retirement is obviously one, but there are plenty of others: having a baby, buying a house, perhaps getting divorced, all those things. And it's those issues that we want to, as it were, be there for people. We want to be at the top of their head when they think about how they're going to approach those problems. So we're pretty convinced that the way that you change people's behaviour in the long term is by thinking about people's attitudes and seeking to influence the way they meet their aspirations. And the first thing we've done about this, as some of you know already, is launch what we've called an online health check. It's all about you. It's not about explaining financial products. It's not about calculating the APR. And 180,000 people have completed it already, and 100,000 have an action plan. And that number will build to millions. So people will come away from our service knowing what they need to do. And then I think you get into Chris's agenda about what are the right products there, and to actually help them to execute that. I was just saying to James, and this is the last thing from me, when we launched our rebranded service in June, the FT described us as the new national wealth service, you see, because we're universal and free, get it? And compared me to William Beveridge. Well, I must say, I think that was a little over the top, but it was a nice thought to kick off with. Thanks very much.
Very good, thank you. Well, like, as I said to Gerard beforehand, given that was in the FT, it must be right. Very good.
So is the Eurozone.
Thanks. I think the last speakers have kind of set out some of the big challenges we're facing, and I think quite a lot of that's around the kind of consumerism, around home ownership, and whether we do actually want to increase the saving rate at this point of the cycle anyway. And I think looking at the longer term is definitely where we should go forward. I'd like to add one area to kind of Gerard's list of pensions and social care that as areas where we're going to be needing to save more, and that's where the changes in welfare reform is we're seeing as well. So crisis loans, which many low-income families relied on in periods where they might have used savings to buy, say, a bed or a washing machine if it broke in the past, but they don't have those savings, they've turned to crisis loans, but they're now being cut back, and so the need for savings to kind of fund these kind of bulky items, certainly the lower end of the income distribution, is all the more needed. I think the problem we have is that the usual tools which we've tried to use aren't actually particularly effective for those people. So a large part of previous governments' attempts at increasing savings have been through ISAs, which, frankly, just do a good job of helping all of us save, and not really helping people save who wouldn't have saved anyway, probably. And so perhaps we need to think about different ways of helping people to save and indeed invest. And I think Gerard's point about how it's about how you feel and think, rather than being about necessary financial incentives or tax breaks. I think that's a really important point, and I think one I'd like to kind of draw on a little bit. So if it's about how we think and feel, not about financial incentives and not about tax breaks, how do we actually go about trying to get people to save? I think the first thing we do need to carry on with the financial education, trying to push that through in schools, doing more, and I think that's both true of the government and also of banks. The last couple of times we've spoken about this, I've made the point that if every time I look at a newspaper at the comparison tables of various different companies, banks' savings products, and I see 5 asterisks and a hashtag at the top, I have to go and look at the minute detail underneath. That's not particularly helpful for someone who doesn't want to have to spend all their life looking at those things and looking at how their rates of rate savings going to change in a year or 6 months because the bonus is gone, that sort of thing. And so I think that's really important. It's the kind of transparency. I think also communications are a really big thing. First of all, on the part of government, I think the financial crisis saw quite a big, has probably dented consumers' view of banks and the savings industry quite a lot. And I think a lack of trust is a really, really big issue. And I think to kind of regain that trust, I think the government needs to do a much better job of actually setting the role of banking and the role of financial services more generally. And I still feel that we are still beating up the banks a bit, perhaps unfairly. And I think we really need to start talking about the role of banks in society and actually trying to boost what is actually a fantastic part of our economy and a really essential part of our economy. Secondly, on the role of government, I think people need to know what they're supposed to be saving. I mean, I think actually a large part of the problem is that people know they have to save. They know they need to be saving, but don't really have any kind of tangible idea of what that might look like and what kind of levels of saving they might need for the future. So, if they need to buy a washing machine, if they become unemployed for 6 months, what sort of money might they need to make ends meet? I think providing something which actually puts some ideas on that is really helpful. And I've talked previously about adopting a similar approach to we use with vegetables and fruit. So it's a 5 a day kind of idea. That although it doesn't really mean anything in practical terms, it's quite a nice way of getting people to do something which they weren't doing otherwise. It's across the supermarkets, and doing something similar with banking or savings. So it's a pound a day of savings, perhaps, or £5 a day, or £10 a week of savings, and then you can start to build that up within the industry, and people actually have a goal to go for. And I think once you have that from government and that kind of message, you can then work with the banks to try and deliver products which actually deliver that for people, and they can see that the £10 a day, or £10 a week, sorry, or £1 a day might actually lead to X number of pounds in a year or 5 years, and we start to see something much more clear, with much greater clarity from the banks in terms of the products they're providing. So I think that kind of information and kind of targeting from both government and banks is probably the biggest thing I'd recommend as a way to go forward. If we're going to go further than just those sorts of things and increasing the savings rate moderately, I think we will have to start looking at how Britain is with housing. That's a really big question, but I think it's one that gets to the heart of the savings issue. I've just got a mortgage through Nationwide, thank you, and basically liquidised all of my assets into this massive lumpy thing, which I now have no savings. So I'm completely against what we're talking about here. So, I mean, that's what everyone does. I mean, that's what we do. We like buying houses, and until we think about that, then maybe the question is, do we actually want to save more rather than how we do it?
That's a meaty issue to get into. Jesse, I see you even have a copy of your tome on the big society with us. So.
Well, I carry it everywhere on the grounds that I can then point to it and make indecently self-promotional gestures in the course of events like this by pointing out it's actually available at staggeringly low, frighteningly low cost on Amazon. So thank you, James, thank you Nationwide, thank you Policy Exchange for having us all here today. As you will be aware, I have a great interest in this issue from several sides of the equation. One is as a former director of BZW, though not on the kind of retail financial side, part of Barclays. I was really working in international development area, about as far removed from the savings rate as you could get, but nevertheless not a million miles away from the financial markets. Secondly, as someone who wrote the Conservative saving policy before the 2005 election, including a thing called the Lifetime Savings Account, which I want to come back to later in these remarks. And now, of course, as a member of the Treasury Select Committee, where we see an awful lot of related issues, touching on some of the questions that have been raised by the panel so far. So I have got, as it were, multiple interest in this topic. On the savings rate, I think the point that was made by Chris about looking across the cycle is absolutely right. You would be insane for most people to be saving at the moment. First of all, because you haven't got any money, and therefore there's nothing to save. And secondly, because if you did, you will be paying off debt, because debt is still at extraordinarily high levels, and personal debt is still at extraordinarily high levels. The structure of savings is not massively encouraging in this country. As you know, broadly speaking, the actual level of cash savings held by households are extremely small on average, and it's clustered very much towards the upper end of the income spectrum, and things like ISAs, which tend to support that, as was hinted earlier on by Matt, rather than spreading that savings culture further down the demographic. Now, we do need a rebalancing. It's been said we need a rebalancing. People often think in terms of rebalancing between, as it were, consumption and investment or production. That's one. Another one is the one that was described earlier, credit versus savings, which is another way of boiling that down. And the third would be across the cycle and between generations. At the moment, we've got a situation in which young people are being quite heavily penalised for decisions that were made in the name of the baby boomers. And one of the aspects of savings that's most nervous-making is the number of people who are going to have to be savings now in order to prop up the number of elderly people in our pay-as-you-go retirement system over the next 20 or 30 years. So, very quickly, why is there no saving? Well, we know several reasons why. One is economic bust. Another is the lack of education. I do think the financial sector as a whole has a tremendous responsibility here, because there's lots of evidence of deliberate complexity. It's rather like energy prices. Why do people make things complex? Because they make more money out of it. It's not just a matter of regulation, it's also a matter of competitive behaviour. So there is complexity. It is also true, as has been said, that median wages have been stagnant. That makes the point about cash in the bank. Interest rates are very low. Why would you say when interest rates are very low, you can't make any money? I mean, that in itself is a tremendous incentive to present consumption. And there is, of course, interest rates are going to remain low for a long time because we've got a slush of money swirling around the world at the moment, and the only way people can think of getting through this current economic mess is by keeping interest rates in negative in real terms. Housing, it's the final one. People prefer to say this is the only country that I'm aware of in the world where housing is used as a means of saving rather than as an alternative to saving, and price inflation is welcomed. Now, in what market is price inflation a good idea? Answer: a housing market if you live in Britain. Bizarre. Anyway, that's that. The real reason, I think, why we haven't got higher levels of saving across the cycle is because of what I call, in my book, available in all good bookshops, rigor mortis economics. I mean, the neuroscience of saving. We now know what the neuroscience of savings is. I mean, in 1 second, broadly speaking, we have different sets of investment horizon. Right? We have short-term investment horizon and we have long-term investment horizon. We don't have what neoclassical economics would call a steadily rising discount, or a steady discount rate with a steady rise in our investment horizon. And not only do we have different interest rates in our minds, those are mapped onto different parts of the brain. So you have the executive motor parts of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is about long-term planning. That's your long-term horizon. But stuck in here, in the amygdala and in the limbic system, is the emotions. The emotions say, "I want it, and I want it now." And guess what? It turns out if you price a mortgage at 3% for 2 years and then 10% for the remaining 25, and I exaggerate somewhat, you're very deliberately activating someone's emotional centers, "I want it now," and deactivating or cutting across their long-term planning. That's why regulation is so important. Why is regulation as bad as it has been? One of the reasons: bad economics, bad understanding of economics. So that's one thing where I think we as a country need to be much smarter about how people actually think about the way they want to save for their lives, and much smarter about how government can start to help them to shape that and to deny them certain options they might give themselves otherwise. Those options will be excised in certain key moments in the life cycle. That's why I think a lifetime savings account is a very good idea. Potentially primed with cash, you can get someone to get into the habit of saving. Saving is morally good for you. This is something politicians never talk about. Why? If I want a flat screen TV, I've got two ways of buying it. Right? I can go and bid a bit of a card and then be paying it off for years afterwards. Or I can say, I'm going to put £10 in the bank this week, £10 the week after, until I can buy my flat screen TV. The second is actually morally good for you. It's about denying yourself something you want in order to do the right thing, knowing that you've injected some structure and modesty and self-control into that, and those virtues then spill out profitably into the rest of your life, and you have higher levels of autonomy, a more active self. Those are the kinds of things that are just good for your life. So how we think about savings is actually related to a much deeper question about how we get people to think of themselves more autonomously and as greater, more able to affect the world around them. When we get that, then the greatest education in saving will come from self-education, not just from excellent services like the one run by Gerard. Thank you very much indeed.
Excellent. Thank you, Jesse. I'm sure you'll all have lots of questions about which particular area of the prefrontal cortex needs to be tweaked in order to radically raise the savings rate. But just before you do that, let me pose a question to the panel. I mean, it sort of seemed to me that you slightly put your finger on this, which is that if the state wants to increase savings, it has all sorts of options. They're just rather unpleasant ones. I mean, you put your finger on the obvious one, which is that if you tax housing more heavily, people will divert money into other sources, or if you force providers other than Nationwide, who are excellent, to make more simple financial products that don't confuse consumers, you can do this. So, I mean, is this not a case where simply the will is lacking, but the options are there for intervention in this market, or is it more complicated than that? Let me go down the panel for a reflection on that.
I mean, I think it is a very complex subject, whether it's front brain or back brain, or it's human nature to want quick gratification, and in a sense, if there are no consequences to that, so it is easy to get the credit card and buy the flat screen television, we will continue to do so until there are consequences. So we need, I think, policy interventions as well as simplification of products and education to incentivise saving in a very pragmatic and sensible way forward. Now, if we go back pre-deregulation, pre-1986, when it was a far less competitive financial services world, you had to save with an institution before you'd be granted a mortgage. Therefore, you could very easily determine what you got as a positive for saving. At the moment, there, apart from those who are saving ISAs, and those customers would save anyway, there is no quick gratification, positive enhancement of the reasons to save. There ultimately are some very painful things if you don't save. No pension income when you retire, no lifeboat to fall back on if you were to lose your job, but they're very much in the future. So I think we need to think about policy interventions that create carrot and stick in the short term to engage people so they will save. And then product providers and regulation needs to respond in a way that they are truly rewarded for those actions, as opposed to penalised through the complexity of the products that we offer.
Gerard, you sort of bravely stated that for a man running an information service that providing information wasn't enough. So.
I'm not providing an information service, I'm running an advice service, as I explained. And I agree with Jesse that the braid is the new black. I'm sure that's true in fashionable circles. But but you're right. I think there is a public policy challenge here. I mean, it does seem to me, and as I said earlier, there are all these risks out there for individuals, not just pensions, which is the one that everybody talks about, but all these others, tuition fees and so on. And the government could. Either cap those risks, as I think Andrew Dillnott is going to suggest about adult social care at some point, and that would have the effect of making those markets easier for producers to move into, equity release and so on, and we could have basic products, and then my service and others no doubt could help people to access them. So I mean, I think there are some public policy routes you can go down, but I think this is both a political question and a social question. If we want a society where things are more equitable and so on, then you have one set of public policies. The state is the best redistributor. That has always been true. It's still true. If that's what we want, that's the way to achieve it. But if what we want is for markets to produce these things, then I think we have to have a better distribution of risk between the state, the producer, and the citizen.
Matt?
Just on your first point about taxing housing, I guess it's a pretty extreme policy which government could put in place, and it would be a hugely unpopular one, I imagine too. But I think, firstly, of course, buying a house is pretty expensive anyway. I've just paid the Inland Revenue a huge amount of money, which I'm not.
So you were taxed?
Yeah, massively, yeah, exactly. So you are taxed hugely when you buy a house, and that's the IFS will tell you that's putting off a lot of people from buying a house because it's a transaction tax. It doesn't seem to work. I think that gets back to my point that these kind of ordinary tax incentive type measures just aren't particularly effective because we have such ingrained behaviour around how we spend our money and what we do with our money. And I think to try and change that, it has to be what I was saying earlier about the information and about trying to educate people through different means. And I think this kind of £1 a day, or just showing people what saving £1 a day or £5 a week, what that would mean in 10 years in terms of a change in their life and what they could afford. You need some adverts on telly from government and from Chris saying, if you save £10 a day in 10 years, you can go to Barbados for 3 weeks or something. It's just giving people some kind of idea about what actually they are saving for and the benefits they are, because they can't see those benefits unless they're shown to them.
Very good. And so, Jesse, just before we go out to the audience, I mean, in addition to the first question, I know this area presents a sort of dilemma for conservatism, does it not? Because Gerard's point is a good one, that in a world in which risk is moving from institutions to individuals, is it possible that these same individuals can at the same time be more free in their decision making, or do you need sort of nudges and regulation to help you cope with this sort of increased risk that you're bearing? And as a conservative, how do you try and sort of pass this dilemma between the sort of dilemma of paternalism in a sense?
Yeah, I don't really see the dilemma. I mean, the conservatism that I espouse is, as you know, a kind of Burkean conservatism on which it is not free markets at any price by any means. Markets are culturally embedded entities, subject to culture and trust in the way anything else might be, and the purpose of having them is in order to satisfy certain social needs. They're not ends in themselves, and therefore, if a market isn't working very well, you don't feel any enormous, as it were, a priori hesitation in looking at why that might be happening and how you can make it work better. And there have been markets in this country which have worked conspicuously badly, and there are large chunks of the financial services sector, I might add, which are grossly uncompetitive at the moment, at a time when we're supposed to be living through the most free market time in finance that we've had, in history. So I don't accept this equation between free markets and competitiveness that people casually draw. I think one of the things we need to think about is not making a lot more change. A vast amount of change is already occurring. The pension system's up in uproar. The entire economy is being turned over. Risk is not being transferred from institutions to individuals. It's being transferred from institutions to the state, and from the state to our children. That's where risk is flowing at the moment. The greatest transfer of risk, entity for the transfer of risk, for redistribution of risk in history is not the state, actually, it's the family. And the state's a relatively new innovation, but what the state is very good at is redistributing cash between one part of society and another, and rightly so. So I would be very nervous about extra change. I think Chris said something very, very interesting and good, and I just want to pick that up for a second. When we're talking about change, we should not necessarily just be talking about carrot and stick. Okay, carrot and stick is still in econ world. Okay, which is the world I think we should be getting away from. When you think of the problem with economics is being less libertarian and a bit more conservative, a bit more paying attention to how things actually are, then you think about habit. Now, a rule, for example, I'm not espousing this, but I'm just saying, a rule that said you could not borrow from an institution unless you had saved with that institution for 2 years would be a very inexpensive way of giving someone a habit which I think would be enormously valuable to them and to their own future financial well-being. And it doesn't involve any carrots and sticks specifically. It's just about doing that. It's very noticeable in the financial crash. The institutions that performed the best were the ones that had the least reliance on the wholesale markets and the longest term investment horizons. And I think Nationwide did remarkably well, as did the Co-op and one or two other institutions in that regard. And so those old-fashioned virtues are rather attractive ones, and we do no wrong if we return to them. I think we're doing.
Very good. Now we've got about 15 or 20 minutes for questions and discussion, so let me take a couple of points. Keep them relatively brief, and if you keep them less than brief, I may even be so rude as to cut you off. Let's go with the two at the back. We'll take two at a time. So, and say who you are, introduce yourself, so our panelists may know where you're coming from.
I'm Sam Barker. I'm Head of Family Policy at the Relationships Foundation. My interest in the event is we did a pressure gauge looking at the pressures on families across Europe, and actually debt is one of the things that pushes us right up and makes it very difficult for us to deliver on this pledge of being the most family-friendly country in Europe, and actually that's a savings problem 20 or 30 years back. My question was to bring investment in, and I was very interested about the way the panel talked about how people think and feel, and if we would, forms of kind of more local capitalism, whether that's actually local stock exchanges or an entrepreneurial spirit that enables me to say, I've got a grand, I'll give it to my brother so he can set up a plumbing business, rather than putting it in an ISA. Actually, how do we change? It's not just changing the mindset of people to be entrepreneurs, it's changing the mindset of people to be investors in local entrepreneurship.
It's interesting. And, excuse my ignorance, what does
Relationships Foundation.
what does your foundation do?
We look at, we've been around since 1994, and we essentially try to reimagine public policy if it was focused on strengthening relationships within communities, within families, within businesses.
The gentleman in front of you in the blue tie.
Question for Jesse, Ian Martin, Citywire. You're calling for long-term savings accounts, also reaching out to the non-middle class, the sort of low-income workers, to say, and also potentially to pre-fund those accounts to give them a boost. But surely those measures are already in the Child Trust Fund and Savings Gateway. What could the Conservatives offer to sort of as alternatives to those measures?
Right. Okay.
Very good. Well, since that was specific,
Shall I just pick up on that?
the first
Yeah,
one.
I'm not advocating those. The approach that I take, that I suggested in the lifetime savings account, is distinct from what the incentives are. The broad thought is you encourage someone to think about their whole lifetime as a time in which they're putting money away and taking it out. You give them a flexible way of doing that, and that you thereby give them an incentive to take an interest in their own financial well-being throughout their life. And I think that gives them longer investment horizons, as well as being a rather nifty way for people to save. That, as I've said, we shouldn't necessarily be encouraging people to save hugely at this stage when they may be better off paying off debt. On the point about entrepreneurship, I think we need a new wave of entrepreneurship, but the problem that has risen, I'm afraid, and one of the problems we have at the moment is that we have done an insufficient job, although I've written rather a lot about this recently, in distinguishing crony capitalism, okay, where people, as it were, succeed because of the position in which they're in rather than because of their own merits. And by the way, I don't have a problem at all with succeeding on the basis that you provided capital to someone who makes money for you. That's a perfectly reasonable position. But it's as it were, logically distinct. But that kind of crony capitalism from the day's work for a day's pay capitalism that actually is going to make the country great again. So we need a wave of entrepreneurship. In this country, it's terribly hard. Broadly speaking, in Germany, if you set up a business, you run it all your life and you give it to your kids. That's the Mittelstand. Okay, that's why Bosch is a multi-billion pound company, right? In Germany, you set up in America, you set up a business, you sell it, you make a ton of money. You set up another one, you sell it, you make a ton of money. Okay, in this country, you set up a business, you sell it, you get to sit on your farm. I'm serious, that is what happens, and it's been happening for 150 years. If you don't believe it, go and read Martin Wiener's book, on the decline of the industrial spirit. This is a traditional English problem, and we need to reach out beyond that and do something about it. So I agree about entrepreneurship. I don't buy local stock markets. I think that's a gimmick. But local sources of funding that encourage people to source money where they can, where local in a community could mean someone you have an email relationship with in Bombay, absolutely.
Are there other, behind the question, not to get into red Toryism or whatnot, but there are sort of other local innovations, local banks, sources of local capital. Are there any other things that you do approve of, if you think?
I love all that stuff. I think we should be experimenting with institutions of every possible kind. I'm just saying I'm not sure that a local stock market is likely to be a successful institution.
Yeah,
but we should be absolutely experimenting with local sources of financing. Absolutely.
Would you like to, I'll come in a slightly different order. Do you want to pick up any of that? Or,
I need to say it's really interesting.
Gerard?
Just a couple of quick points on this point. I don't think local stock market's the answer, but what I do think is that people do save, and poor people save too. They save for weddings and they save for Christmas and so on. They don't necessarily save through formal institutions, and they don't necessarily save in the way that everybody wants them to, but they do save. Even the very poorest people in society, not just in Britain, but in your new home in Mumbai, they save too. They buy jewellery and all that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of, they just don't do it. We don't get the customers we deserve, which is always a pretty crappy explanation, it seems to me, for the failure of any market. There's clearly loads of cash around in local economies, and it's clearly very badly allocated in economic terms. So yes, of course we need new mechanisms for the allocation of capital in local economies, and I agree with what Jesse said about entrepreneurship too. I'm struck by how very few new entrants there are to these markets, both retail markets and indeed small business markets. I mean, how many new small business lenders have been set up in the last 20 years, And why is that? Tesco, M&S, all sort of Virgin, they've all sort of slightly tangled with this, none of them got very far. Why is that? You would have thought they might be interested in this market. So clearly we do need more activity, and we need some new entrants. But I don't think the problem is a shortage of cash in these economies, or that people don't want to save it efficiently. I think the problem is that of the options available, they're not entirely persuaded that they're going to do the job for them. I mean, remember the Christmas hamper scheme? How can you have a savings scheme that goes down with debt? Discuss,
Great.
I think an overall observation would be that the policy response should be to foster diversity of business models in financial services, whether it be building societies, credit unions, institutions we've maybe not even thought of in terms of how they could recycle capital in the local community. And I think it's really important that as we look at a policy response to de-risk financial services, we don't kill the diversity of business models that will deliver this local free flow of capital. We should be really careful that we make sure there is diversity in the provision of savings, lending, and movement of capital. And I think there's a danger we're going in the opposite direction as a de-risk response.
Very good. Let's get a couple more points. The lady here and the gentleman here, and I'll come back to you in the middle in a minute. So go ahead again. Say who you are.
Claire Durkin, URS Corporation, an American infrastructure company. I would quite like to draw the parallel between the individual. There's been a lot of talk about they, just like to point out that it's us, and companies and government, and then to think very much about savings and investment. Because it seems to me that the problem we don't save is because we don't have the long-term vision, and we don't have the long-term idea of why to save, and we don't invest when we save. Exactly the same with companies. We are short-term, we don't do R&D, and we just pay off our shareholders. And similarly with government, we are gutless when it comes to tackling the planning and comes to investing in the infrastructure and the intellectual infrastructure of our country. We talk and we don't deliver. All governments have been the same. We are a short-term world, and it's not just because it's our instinct, because some countries do save, so it's not just which part of the brain we use. So I think we ought to be thinking not just about savings, but purpose and aspiration and investment. We save to invest. We invest in our children, we invest in our education, we invest in our old age. And we don't talk about that. I do not want to be told that it's good for me. I want to be told that there's a vision, and it's what businesses are doing, so I don't think it's just me, and it's what the government is doing, so I don't think it's just me. And so I would quite like to hear views of all three, how we transform all three into long-term, aspirational and delivering sort of things.
Very good. Okay, the gentleman here again.
Yeah.
Say who
David
you are.
Harrison, Tor Financial Consulting, directed to the panel. Question inspired by The Inside Job, the movie, and also the former World Bank economist who worried in 2007 about risk, that senior executives of banks and leading financial institutions are remunerated more on taking on more and more risk rather than preserving a profitability or a future for their companies. And I'd like to get comments, as Jesse and others have alluded to, is that if anything we learned about the subprime mortgage was that leading executives of major financial institutions around the world were remunerated more on taking on more risk and ultimately seeing some of their organisations collapse. And was that a failure of regulation or just the reptilian part of the brain where fear played out and greed came to the fore?
Okay. And let me just take one. I'll take one more, and then we'll sort of get a range
We've
of.
got to talk about saving, which I know is obviously the topic of the session. But should we go to tackle debt first? Generation X at the moment thinks that debt is totally acceptable. And if you're 28, okay to be in debt for £30,000 because all my mates are as well. And I think that before we start coming up with changing behaviour on saving, we have to actually put out that message that debt does not work on an individual level.
What was your name, sir?
Divert and cigar communication, but I help governments try and change behaviour too.
Very good. Okay, so we have long-termism, risk within financial institutions as a barrier to savings, and debt before savings. So would you want to just pick one of those, or come back on a couple of those?
I mean, I think
As you see fit.
the bonus one is quite interesting, and I don't think it has yet been cracked, and I think actually goes to the investment story as well, because what we're really talking about, whether it's debt versus saving or subprime mortgages and a quick turn on of profit, is a mismatch or an asymmetric view of when risks emerge. So it's very clear that you could do a subprime mortgage, and actually for 4, 5, 6 years, when the times were good, there was no risk. When the economy went through the cycles that they always go through, actually the risk emerged. But the guys who've done it were no longer there or made their fortune and could move on. To some extent, that is the same about borrowing versus investing for the future. Now, I will now step away from a nationwide perspective and talk about, partly I think the answer is social and families and needing to think that you live beyond today and you, and exist for the longer term and your family unit and your community. And ultimately, if we can engender those kind of responses, which is what created building societies 150 years ago, when the community identified a need for housing and saving, then we might remove some of this short-term remuneration impact that drives the wrong behaviour when you look at it over a multi-year period.
Jesse, you were nodding through some of that.
Yes, I of course very much agree with diversity of business models. Of course, a lot of diversity has been driven out. I mean, in the 1980s, the City of London was a very diverse, much more diverse place now. You had partnerships which took risk, you had institutions with capital which didn't really take risk, you had lots of building societies, you had a much wider aquarium. Now you have essentially the triumph of the corporate model in the financial services. An awful lot of diversity has been abolished. Credit unions, there are a few small number, there's a small number of building societies still left. I think Nationwide is the only big building society.
Yeah, well, over half the sector.
There you go. So diversity's gone at the moment. Diversity would be a very fine thing. And if I may just gently tweak our sponsor, it shouldn't necessarily be supporting the RDR, whose predictable effect will be to push IFAs, a sort of form of diversity, out of the market. So I mean, I think these things cut both ways. In terms of short-termism, I totally agree with the lady who raised the issue of short-termism. Of course, we need to be doing that. It's obviously not a matter of the brain, just the brain. It's a matter of how the brain interacts with institutions and is taken advantage of by institutions. Certain institutions promote long-term thinking. That's what the institution of the family business does in Germany, and certain don't. I've myself made various suggestions, written and otherwise, on how we improve corporate governance. I hope to set up a firm called Institutional Shareholder Services. It's the largest worldwide advisor on corporate governance, now owned by Thomson Financial. One of the things that we need to do if we're going to wean people off quarterly obsession with EPS is to start sorting their own incentives out in a way that gives them a long-term goal in the future. As Chris said, there's a massive asymmetry in the way in which the banks have operated historically. Basically you pump up the balance sheet, and if you make any money, executive pay is very highly correlated with size of institution, or you buy another player for the same reason. But and when it goes tits up, the good news is you've socialised the risk and already retired or taken your golden parachute or your bonus pool. So those asymmetric incentives need to be completely rethought. I would not, however, contrary to the lady's suggestion, give up on the idea of moral opprobrium. I think it's rather important for society not to say, oh, there they go. It's actually, of course, banker bashing can be taken too far, although I don't think it has so far. I think we have a very serious issue. It's a 10 to 15 year process of getting the economy rebalanced, and if people think that money's been taken out of their pockets for all the wrong reasons, we should very well be insisting on that until the position is fixed. And if we don't do that, you won't get it cleaned up, because people will think it's okay to take money out of the system for their personal gain. And exactly the same problem in politics, or indeed, in some respects, in journalism.
I mean, I don't, in a sense, need to repeat the question about aspirations. I absolutely agree with all that, and that's, in a sense, the game we're in as far as individuals are concerned. I mean, I do agree with Jesse that there are some cultural factors here, but you also have to remember the extent to which British culture has changed. Those of you like me were around in the late 1970s. you know, we had lots of long-term thinking then of all the wrong kinds, you know. It was a bleak and shoddy and miserable place with rubbish economic policies pursued by both governments, you know, or both parties rather. We don't want to go back to a deferential, if I may say so, wholly risk-averse society. I mean, our economy was 25% smaller than France then. Now, okay, we're going through a bit of a bad time, but we got to a point where our economy was bigger. You know,
They'll be shrinking it shortly when the French banks go bust.
well, back to us. But you know, we don't just be careful what you wish for here. You know, yes, it's true they all retire to the country and so on, and they all want to be Lord Downton or whatever his name is. But you know, there are clearly cultural factors here. But culture changes. You know, I mean, and you can change cultures. And the Tories, above all people, know how you might shift cultures around. You know. So I do think that, you know, part of what we have to do, and this is what Jesse's up to with his big society stuff and whatnot, is think a little bit more, not just about how individuals should behave, but the kind of relationships we want in society, what do we think about the worst of? Are we happy to have, you know, as George Young once said, you know, people that you step over as you go into the opera? You know, you do have to think about those kinds of questions. And I don't really think you can really start to answer these questions about institutional arrangements, regulation, and so on, until you think through some of that. We know we don't want this culture, you know, of greed and all the rest of all the things that Jesse was talking about, all these rapacious bankers and whatnot. But what we don't want what we had, which was very long term, not very aspirational, highly deferential, full of, you know, pretty rubbish behaviour, which I, as an immigrant, found deplorable then, as I would now.
Yeah, I think that point's really interesting. I know I've written down here basically what do we aspire to, and I think almost we're going quite a long way from perhaps what we were talking about earlier. And I think actually that is now the key question: is what do we aspire to? And I think, you know, Jesse was saying earlier about retiring to a farm, and you know, really, is it really the case that we don't all want to do that? And is that if we did do that, would it be a problem? I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing, and you know, we all talk about serial entrepreneurs and getting entrepreneurial ideas going, but do people in the UK want that, and should we be trying to force that on them? Question. Similarly, low-income people taking on debt, buying a TV now rather than buying it later. That's sure as hell what I would do. I don't want to wait 2 years to get a TV. My life is pretty rubbish. I don't have very much money. I'd like it now. I'd like to do what my friends do. I'd like to do what the rest of the people in society do, and that's watch a big fat telly. You know, that's a really good thing to be doing now. And if I have to pay more money for it in the long term, you know, that's the trade-off I have to take. And you know, I think we have to be really careful that we're not pushing our own views about from sat here and there about what people's aspirations should be, without thinking about, you know, what, you know, their situations and what they'd actually like to do. I think that's a really good thing to think about. Also, and kind of moving on from there, also the kind of the families and communities kind of idea that, you know, it should be more about building on your family and working with the communities. Also, think it's really interesting how that ties together with some of the questions we're talking about around taking risk and entrepreneurial side, and whether you can actually have the kind of big society idea and also the kind of big business thing, and how that fits together. I think it's quite an interesting question. I realise I should probably have said that from that side of the floor, but it was just some kind of thoughts on what's been said, basically.
Very good. Let me take a few, just a couple of very short final questions, then we'll go back for a sort of a final thought from each member of the panel, and we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. So you had one question, and if there's, why don't you go ahead, and if there's no, and the lady at the back, and then, but do keep it very brief.
Chris McBride from Which. It's going quite a long way back now, but Jesse and Matt were talking about the complexity of savings accounts and how they you can be got on a bonus rate and then it's cut. And we did research a while ago about how hard it is to find your interest rate on a statement, or you have to click through 4 pages on your online banking. And you can talk about appealing to different parts of people's minds, but appealing to their eyes first might be a good place to start.
And the lady at the back again, so you.
Cal King from Provident Financial. We supported some work earlier this year looking at saving behaviour of those on lower incomes. If I had to encapsulate that research, it said saving on a low income, it's about what's in your head as much as what's in your pocket. And reflecting on that, I would like to say that individuals that took part in that research, they were looking for a different kind of product. They weren't necessarily looking for a simpler kind of product. They expressed quite a lot of clear thought about the sophistication of the product that they wanted, It's just a very different kind of product, and the economics are more challenging in terms of bringing that to market.
Very good. Two good points. Well, let's just have a sort of either pick up that or give a final reflection before we close, and we'll go to Nationwide first.
I think on the disclosure point, I'm absolutely right, and over time, interest rates are appearing on statements, and the industry is getting better at that. Nationwide is somewhat at the forefront. Having said that, even when products are properly disclosed in the way you as a consumer would expect them to be, you still get some quite strange behaviour out there where these products with bonuses on, if you put a product out there with a long-term rate guarantee versus one with a bonus, the one with the bonus will always be bought because the customer, for whatever reason, will be attracted by the high rate, whether they understand how it works or whether they think they will always be quicker than the financial institution at moving the money when the bonus matures. Clearly that doesn't happen because those products wouldn't exist if everybody moved at the point that the bonus came off, because the economics work by going from the high rate to the low rate and generating value in that way. So I think disclosure can be improved, should be improved, is being improved, but it won't ultimately be, I don't think, the total answer to getting people to select the best products from themselves.
Very good. Matt, do you want a final thought?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Chris is completely right that getting the information there is really key, is what I was saying earlier about asterisks, and if that's always there, then that's a real problem. I think banks need to be an awful lot clearer about what they're providing in terms of the terms and conditions of their account. And I think also that the lady at the back was saying about the different kind of products. I'd be really interested to speak a bit more about what those might look like. Certainly with my kind of views earlier that it is about putting a target in people's mind and then banks providing some new products to actually achieve those targets in a kind of clear and transparent way. I think that would be a huge step forward for this kind of agenda.
Gerard, final thought?
Just on this question of complex products and not making people being able to understand things and so on. I mean, it's one of the paradox of a lot of markets, but certainly the retail financial services market, that the answer to the problems of choice and freedom is not less choice and freedom, it's more choice and freedom. But obviously we have to have clear communications and so on. So I would hesitate before going down a regulatory route which said that because people don't understand these products, we need to have them made simpler and more barriers to entry and so on and so forth. I think the problem in these markets has as much to do with product innovation or lack of product innovation and lack of product diversity. So we need to open up these markets, not restrict them. And I think on the wider point about long-term thinking and long-term savings, I think the biggest risk here is that we set out a policy framework which is more interested in building a better yesterday.
Very good. And you need not limit your listening to simply this last word to Jesse, because you can also buy his excellent book, The Big Society, which is, as you'll doubtless say, of course I've read it. It really is a good book. But a final word to Jesse, a sort of final reflection.
No, well, thank you all very much. It's been a really interesting session. I feel thrilled by the panel's comments. They've been incredibly interesting. Gerard said something earlier which I thought was profoundly wise and right, which is people sometimes save when it's not in their economic best interest. Someone who saves to buy a piece of jewellery for a family holiday thing, not always doing the things in their economic best interest. They're doing it because they really need something and they believe that's the right way to do it. That's not important. It's a form of economic irrationality, but we need to get much smarter about what economic rationality actually is. And one of the things we need to do, and it's a constant theme of what I've been saying, is pay attention to how people actually think. Lots of evidence exists that many people think tax relief is the same thing as tax. Some people think in this country, a non-trivial number of people in this country think, Sandler review showed it, that an APR is an interest rate in your favour. So someone says, well, I've got a 19%, I've got a 27% APR, look what an idiot you are. I mean, there's enormous amount of ignorance about this topic. It's also true, and this is again a bit controversial, you can have too much choice. If you look at, all the stuff that Sunstein and Thaler have in the book on nudge, we know, if you give someone 1,000 options for their pension plan, any one of which is better than the current arrangement of putting it out of the mattress, they will not do it. If you give them 3 and say, then they will make a choice. If you auto-enroll them in one and then say, here are 2 other ones we think are very good, and if you don't like those, there's some other ones you can look at, you'll get a much higher take-up rate. So it really matters how the state manages the presentation, or the industry manages the presentation of choice. And the state does have a role, and can have a role, in shaping some of those alternatives to get people to do things that is massively in their interest, but they simply don't understand in the specific case. Now, that isn't the man from Whitehall knows best. It's just a more subtle way of setting the thing up so that people make choices in their best interest, and they would never regret, or very rarely regret, if they did take them. So I suppose I would say that the answer lies somewhere in between, and this is a very bland and boring state intervention and ultra freedom of markets.
Very good. Well, we'll say thank you very much to Nationwide and Policy Exchange, and I would ask you to give our panel a round of applause for a very stimulating